forgotten room. It had always been an ordinary house, or so Sarah thought, nestled on the edge of town, surrounded by wild, overgrown gardens. It was the place she'd grown up in, a place that held the memories of her childhood, the scent of her mother's cooking, the laughter of family dinners. Yet, for as long as she could remember, there was always something off about it. Something dark, like a shadow that clung to the very walls. Something she could never quite touch, but always felt lurking just beneath the surface. When she was a child, the house had felt enormous. Every creaking floorboard echoed like a distant whisper. Every draft that swept through the halls felt like a sigh of something that had been there before. But there was one part of the house Sarah had never dared venture into. The end of the hallway on the second floor. The door there was strange, unlike the others. While every door in the house had a familiar wear, a softness to the wood, this one stood in stark contrast. It was cold, as if it had never been touched, and always locked. Even as a child, Sarah had known not to go near it. Her parents never spoke of it. Whenever she asked, they merely told her that it was a room best left alone, that it was part of the house's history and best forgotten. But the more they told her not to go near it, the more the door intrigued her. Now, many years later, after her parents had passed away, Sarah found herself back in the old house, standing at the base of that familiar staircase. The walls seemed to whisper their forgotten stories, the air thick with dust and memories. It had been a long time since she had stepped foot in the place, and yet everything felt the same. The old house seemed to breathe with its own life, waiting for something to happen. It was late afternoon when Sarah, feeling the weight of the house pressing on her, walked up the stairs. Her footsteps echoed in the silence, each step bringing her closer to the door she had never dared to approach. The hallway seemed longer now, stretched out in an unnatural way. The door at the end of the hall loomed like a black mark on the landscape of her mind. It was impossible not to be drawn to it. When she reached it, her breath caught in her throat. There it was, the door, exactly as she remembered it. The brass handle, now tarnished and covered in dust, seemed to gleam in the dim light. For a moment, Sarah hesitated. A cold chill swept over her, and she found herself wondering why she had never asked more questions when she was younger. Why had her parents never let her inside? What was so dangerous about this room? She shook her head, dismissing the feeling. She was an adult now. Her parents were gone. There was no reason to fear what lay beyond this door. With a deep breath, she reached for the handle. The door creaked open with a sound that reverberated down the hallway, like the moan of a long-forgotten soul. The room beyond was shrouded in darkness, the thick air of age and neglect hanging heavy. She stepped inside, her footsteps muffled by the thick layer of dust on the floor. The air was cold, unnervingly so, as if the room had been waiting for her to open it. The room was small, smaller than she had imagined, and completely bare. No furniture, no personal items, just the barest hint of something unsettling, in the way the walls seemed to close in around her. But there was one thing that caught her eye immediately, standing in the far corner of the room. A large, ornate mirror. The mirror was stunning, tall, framed in dark wood with intricate carvings, its surface marred only by age. But as Sarah stepped closer, she saw something that stopped her in her tracks. The glass seemed wrong. It wasn't just dusty. It seemed to shimmer in a way that made her stomach twist, as though the mirror itself was alive. She reached out hesitantly and wiped the grime from its surface. What she saw in the reflection made her freeze. It wasn't her. It was her mother. Her face, pale and twisted in a silent scream, stared back at her through the glass. Her mother's eyes were wide, full of terror and desperation, her mouth moving, but no sound came from the mirror. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She recoiled, stumbling backward, her mind racing. It couldn't be. It was impossible. Her mother had died years ago. But as her heart pounded in her chest, she realized the reflection wasn't just her mother. It was her mother trapped. The image in the mirror shifted, becoming more frantic. Her mother's hands pressed against the glass, her fingers trembling as if reaching for something. A silent plea. And then, the reflection began to change. The room behind her mother's reflection twisted, darkened. The walls started to warp, bending inward. The air grew colder, suffocating. Something in the room moved. It was subtle at first, but then, the shadows in the corner seemed to stretch and writhe, as though something was emerging from the dark recesses of the room. Sarah's pulse quickened. She backed away from the mirror, her heart hammering in her chest. The shadows grew larger, more solid. A figure, tall and thin, stepped out from the darkness. It was no longer just a reflection. It was real. The figure was humanoid, but its limbs were unnaturally long, its skin pale and stretched tight over bone. Its eyes were hollow, black voids that seemed to suck in the light around it. It took a step toward her, and the floor beneath Sarah's feet groaned in protest, as though the house itself was alive. "You should never have opened the door," a voice whispered, low and guttural, emanating from the figure, yet seeming to come from everywhere at once. The figure reached out with its elongated fingers, its touch ice-cold as it brushed against her arm. A wave of nausea washed over Sarah as she tried to pull away, but the grip of the creature tightened. Its eyes locked onto hers, and she felt an unnatural pull, as though it was trying to drag her into the very depths of its soul. In the distance, she could hear something faint, like the sound of muffled sobbing. Her eyes flicked to the mirror again. Her mother's reflection had changed. No longer a terrified plea, it was now a look of resignation, as if she had given up, as though she was trapped here, forever. "Leave," her mother's image whispered, though the word was barely audible. "Leave before it's too late." The figure tugged harder, dragging her toward the center of the room. Panic surged through Sarah, and with every ounce of strength she had left, she fought against its pull. She reached for the door, but it was too far. Too far. Her vision blurred as the room seemed to close in on her. "It's already too late," the creature hissed, its mouth stretching unnaturally wide. In that moment, everything around her seemed to snap. The door to the room slammed shut, the house groaning like it was being torn apart. The darkness in the room seemed to consume her, pulling her into the mirror, into the depths of the shadows, where no one would ever find her. The last thing Sarah saw before the world went black was her mother's face, no longer trapped behind the glass. Her reflection. And then, nothing. When the police arrived days later, there was no sign of Sarah, no trace of the room or the mirror. Just the old house, silent as ever, standing at the edge of the town, forgotten. But if you listen closely, on quiet nights when the wind howls through the trees, you can hear her voice. "Leave before it's too late,"